So we talked a little bit about the overarching numbered treaty process. One of the things that is specific, okay, about the numbered treaties, and one of the sort of big transitions that sort of marks a difference between the numbered treaties and the earlier treaties, which are sort of negotiated in Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes, is that they start from a different premise. So in earlier treaties, what was happening was Indigenous groups and European settlers were negotiating about what space was available for settlers. So when we talk about land, what is actually happening is Indigenous groups are agreeing to sort of say, oh, well, we can give you this portion of land over here and you stay over there and you can sort of live your life. When we get to the numbered treaties, the government of Canada has reversed their position. They've flipped it. So they're working from an assumption that most of the land is going to settlers and most of the land is going to be available to the government to kind of do whatever they want with it, whether that's establish farms or sort of mine natural resources. And instead of sort of delineating space for settlers, they're going to be delineating space for Indigenous people. And those parcels of land are what you've heard referred to as reservations and reserves. But I want to talk a little bit about how that system works, partially because most Canadians don't understand it very well. So if you look at the Treaty 6 terms, you'll sort of see like a reserve allocation of this much per family of this. Okay. The first thing to understand about that allocation of land and that sort of space conversation is that that is not enough land to maintain a traditional Indigenous way of life. Okay? If I give you 1 acre per family of 5, you do not have enough geographical space in order to pursue a sort of hunting and fishing lifestyle and to sustain your family that way. There isn't enough space. It is designed on the assumption, as far as the government is concerned, that over time, Indigenous populations are going to transition to agriculture and to growing crops because an acre is enough land to support a family of 5 in terms of growing a farm. Like an acre is a decent farmstead. However, one of the challenges when you sort of deal with that is that you have to talk about where those parcels of land go. And when we talk about placing reservations and placing reserves for Indigenous groups, you're talking about the people who are being asked to choose this land and to decide if this land is an acceptable place for them to live who don't have experience farming. And one of the things that that means is that partially because of those ethnocentric ideas and the idea that like, well, really the Indigenous people are sort of backwards and they're not going to be able to make good use of the land anyway, and partially because they figured they could get away with it, the British Crown and the Canadian government in a lot of ways offered Indigenous groups what would be considered marginal or otherwise less than ideal farmland for their reservations. So although there's an expectation that reservations are going to allow Indigenous people this transition time to learn agriculture, they've actually been given land that's not very good for agriculture. And you can sort of take a look, if you actually look at where the reserves are located, you're like, no, that's not great farmland if you know a lot about farmland. Okay, so there's that kind of piece. There are some other, I guess, like quirks to understand about the reserve system. And one of them is that the reserve system is essentially the only way that the federal government has to sort of administer services, systems, policy for Indigenous Canadians. Um, the, the way that the system was set up, the way that the Indian Act was set up, there's an idea that grants and rights accrue to bands, i.e. Indigenous groups, not to individual Indigenous people. And that has a number of really weird consequences that a lot of people don't understand about the way that reserves work. So because of that assumption, because of the idea that rights according to treaty accrued to a group of people, not an individual person, nobody owns a house on a reserve. No individual person owns a house on a reserve because the way that the law is set up, You can't. Because the reserve land accrues to a group of people, not to families. And that seems like a relatively simple shift, except it allows things to get really, 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 really complicated. So I imagine most of my students either are or have lived in rental accommodations. And I want you to think about what happens in terms of, hey, the faucet's broken, or hey, the toilet's leaking, and what you have to go through to fix that. Okay? And then I want you to understand that in order to deal with that sort of issue on reserve, you basically have to go to what is essentially a municipal government. And if there are big problems, say there's mold, then your municipal government has to argue all the way with Ottawa, who's 500, like thousands of kilometers away in a different time zone with different priorities. Okay? If you've ever heard conversations, and we'll get into them a little bit later on, about the low quality of housing on reserve, that's part of the reason, is actually that people don't own it. Which means that they don't have the same incentives to take care of it, and they can't make the improvements that they want to make, right? If I have a family of 4 children and I only have 3 bedrooms and I want to put in another 2 bedrooms, I can't do that. Even if I have enough money to pay for it, I can't because I don't own the house. Which means that in order for me to do that, I kind of have to negotiate with the band council, and it adds this extra layer of complexity. And there's a lot of people who just go, yeah, I'm not going to bother with that. That's stupid. I'm not doing it. So there's that kind of challenge in terms of actual maintenance of housing stock. But there are other challenges that come with that too. So we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the Nisga'a sort of much later on. But what do you do if you want to start a business but you don't own your home? So that probably hasn't crossed a lot of your paths right just yet, but for a lot of Canadians, if they decide they want to start a business, what they do in order to get the capital to do so is they go to the bank and they sign a loan against their house. And that means that if you don't have a house, you can't get the mortgage. You can't get the loan because there's nothing to secure it, and the sort of banks are a little bit wary of that sort of process. So there's a lot of kind of things that fall out of sort of the reserve system at a policy level in terms of how policies are administered and who owns what and what that sort of conversation looks like. But there's also some questions that most Canadians do not understand about the way that the reserve system was administered, in particular in sort of its earlier years. So one of the things that you will know if you've ever heard the Arrogant Worms sing about this is Canada is really big. Okay, and when we start setting up these treaties, I mean, Treaty 6 is signed in 1876. There are a lot of things that we use in order to be able to administer the country today that just don't exist, right? I don't know about anyone else, but I sure filed my taxes online this year. That's not a thing you can do in 1876, which means that in order to be able to sort of administer these sorts of policies, you need a representative of the government. And one of the things that you need to understand is that most of those reserves are farther away from the cities that would have had, I guess, built-in representatives of the federal government. Like if I need to talk to the federal government, I probably am going to Service Canada and I'm going downtown, right? Outside of Edmonton, in really small communities, that building, that sort of service center, that group of bureaucrats doesn't exist. So the government creates it, and they create it in the form of Indian agents. Indian agents are essentially federal government employees who are sent off to reserves with a job description that I do not envy in the slightest. So they are essentially responsible for administering all funding and all payments to bands and members of the reserve. Because, again, there's an assumption that Indigenous people cannot do this on their own. They are also responsible for acting as investigators and police. So if there's a problem and there's a conflict, their job is to resolve it. They're also responsible for granting permits to leave the reservation. This is an important thing to understand because for a long time there was a perception that Indigenous people off the reservation, if you've ever heard that quote, that sort of expression, that idiom used, it has this root about Indigenous people in particular being disruptive. It's one of the reasons that I personally don't use it because I don't like that sort of connection. But that sort of piece, you needed to get a permit to do so because there was an understanding among most European Canadians that Indigenous people were going to be dangerous and disruptive away from their homes. And so it was necessary to get a permit to be able to leave. If you, for example, needed to go into the city to go get treatment for tuberculosis, you needed a permit from the Indian agent. Okay. First of all, that's a really broad job description. Okay. But there are other problems with this job that make it be way worse than it sounds like when I describe it like that on paper. And most of that is something that we'll come back to when we talk about residential schools in a bit, is that this job is set up in a way that the kind of people who generally want to take it are exactly the last people you want to actually occupy this job. Okay? So what this job entails is people who are working largely in isolation, right? If you're working on a reserve, you might well be the only white person for hundreds of kilometers. Okay, so you don't have access to like a social life, you don't have access to like friends and family. You're pretty isolated to begin with. Okay, you are effectively the only authority, right? You get to control all of the money, and structurally, we'll get to this, the people you are working with, i.e. the Indigenous people, don't have the opportunity to challenge you. Okay? And on top of that, it doesn't really require any training, right? There's no like training program for Indian agents, and there's no like standard of ethics for that. So what that means is that practically there's, first of all, a lot of turnover in this job, okay? Because there are people who, with the best of intentions, go, yeah, I can do that job, and then realize, oh, heavens, no, I can't. I can't live for my entire year surrounded by people whose language I don't speak. I can't live my entire life without being able to go to a grocery store that stocks food that I recognize, without being able to go to a restaurant. And if that sounds like the kind of mental health struggles a lot of people are experiencing right now during the coronavirus pandemic, then you have a sense of just how squirrely this can make you, and all of you have access to the internet. Don't have that as an Indian agent in 1876. So there's that kind of turnover, which is really difficult on communities because it means that if the Indian agent says, oh yeah, of course you can get that permit to leave the reserve in 3 months to go to your sister's wedding, great. What if the Indian agent is different in 3 months? And that leads into sort of the second challenge of the position of the Indian agent, which is that because of the way that it's structured, because Indigenous people don't have the same legal standing and the same access to the corridors of power to basically stand up and say, hey, our Indian agent is a jerk and is doing things in ways that are corrupt, in ways that they're skimming money off the top, there's no way to challenge that. So there are a lot of people who did this job as Indian agents in ways that would not meet ethical standards today, right? You have conversations about some examples of things like Indian agents saying, yeah, sure, I'll give you the permit you need to go get treatment for tuberculosis, but I'd really like you to perform oral sex first. Or, yeah, sure, I'll give you the $1,000 of extra grants for ammunition and twine, but I want you to give me $100 back. And all of those things can happen in a system like this, where the only people, where there's no one around to sort of check up on Indian agents, because in a lot of ways, Indigenous people were considered to be children, right? We talked about the value of paternalism and that kind of conversation. Part of that is related to this. We're getting into that sort of idea about Indigenous people legally being children, as problematic as it is, in our next video.